What's the most you ever lost on a coin toss?
Sir?
The most you ever lost on a coin toss?
I don't know. I couldn't say.
Call it.
Call it.
Yes.
Pascal's wager requires a monstrous premise of equal chance. This video is the second part of a series in which I elucidate upon the objections to and defences of Pascal's wager. And while it's not necessary for you to watch the previous part to enjoy the fruits found here, I'd recommend that you do should you want a full and comprehensive understanding of the argument. Plus, if you do watch the first, you'd be giving me more views. And as you likely know, that's like crack to YouTubers.
Ah! It's not a liquid! It's a great many pieces of solid matter that form a hard floor-like surface! Ah!
In the previous video, we steel-manned Pascal's wager and emphasised that since it was published posthumously, one must read it generously and engage with subsequent philosophers to confront it in its strongest form. We will, of course, do precisely this throughout this series. But for now, here's the gist. Either God exists or God does not exist, and you either believe in God or you do not believe in God. Now, since the worst possible outcome of wagering that God does exist is negligible to the best possible outcome of wagering that God does not exist, Pascal argues we ought to wager, then, without hesitation, that he is. In essence, it's an argument from superdominance, and given the premises, it's a great one. I'm Stephen Woodford, thanks for joining me, and this is Pascal's Monstrous Premise.
Well, look, I need to know what I stand to win.
Everything.
How's that?
You stand to win everything. Call it.
Throughout his argument, Pascal employed the analogy of flipping a coin to represent the existence and non-existence of God, one in which either heads or tails will turn up. And in doing so, he implicitly assigned a whopping 50% chance of God existing. Now, some defenders of Pascal's wager claim this to be a straw man, but I disagree. For one, Pascal clarified this assumption by stating within his presentation,
since there's an equal risk of gain and of loss,
and a sentence later, there is an equal risk of loss and gain. Observing this implicit premise, the philosopher Ian Hacking, in his book titled The Emergence of Probability, which is a fantastic read by the way, wrote that Pascal's wager requires a monstrous premise of equal chance. We have no good reason of picking half as the chance of God's existence. This argument can only work for the people who are, in the strongest sense, exactly as unsure whether God exists as they are unsure whether he does not exist. Against all other agnostics, another argument is called for. Indeed, Pascal's monstrous premise is, well, monstrous. But crucially, it's not actually required for the argument to work. In fact, it's so not needed that the vast majority of proponents don't include it, and it's primarily because of this that they see its inclusion as a red herring or straw man. But why, then, did Pascal not only include it, but give it so much emphasis? Well, he gives his justification a few times throughout his writing, but in my estimation, he does so most notably at the beginning of his most substantive rendition, stating,
if there is a God, he is infinitely incomprehensible, since, having neither part nor limits, he has no affinity to us. We are then incapable of knowing either what he is, or if he is. This being so, who will dare to undertake the decision of that question? Not we, who have no affinity to him.
Thus, so far as Pascal is concerned, God is incomprehensible, and hence when presenting his wager he insists that reason can decide nothing here. Now, in today's age of apologetic acrobatics, when theists speak of their God being incomprehensible, they do not mean it in the sense that we can't comprehend God whatsoever, but rather that we can't comprehend God exhaustively. That is, we can't quite understand why God created parasites whose life cycle necessarily causes blindness, why he lets children die of cholera, and why he allows earthquakes to crumble his own churches. In other words, for modern theists, incomprehensible is a synonym of God is mysterious. And my favourite response to this mental gymnastics is to borrow a sentence from John Adams. Mystery is a convenient excuse for absurdity. Pascal, however, meant it literally. he believed that God is utterly incomprehensible, adding,
Who then will blame Christians for not being able to give a reason for their belief, since they profess a religion for which they cannot give a reason? If they proved it, they would not keep their word. It is lacking proof that they are not lacking in sense.
Again, most proponents forego this premise, but if one was to accept it, and as Hackings puts it, refuse to look at any observation or experimental data bearing to the existence of a Christian God, then when combined with the fact that we have to wager, it would be rational to assign a 50% probability to the proposition. Which is to say, given these premises, Pascal's analogy of flipping a coin is not only fair, but rational. To use the language currently favoured by philosophers, Pascal's argumentation is valid, but it certainly isn't sound. Now, to illustrate how it's not sound, consider this. If the sun was incomprehensible to us in the same way in which Pascal insists that God is incomprehensible, we would have absolutely no idea whatsoever if we'd be graced by its warmth tomorrow, since reason can decide nothing here. And if we were, as Pascal puts it, embarked, we would be rational to assign a 50% probability to the proposition. In fact, we'd be rational to assign a 50% probability to any dichotomous proposition that we assume to be incomprehensible, such as Allah, Zeus, Vishnu, Odin, pixies, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, Russell's Teapot, the Flat Earth, and the government turning the frickin' frogs gay.
Do you understand that? Turn the freaking frogs gay! Serious crap!
And it gets worse. In this bag there is one 6-sided dice, but what's the chances of it being blue? If reason can decide nothing here, and you are embarked, rationality dictates that you assign a 50% probability to the proposition. But now let me separately ask you another dichotomous question. What's the chances of it being yellow? 50%. Okay, what about red? 50%. And so with just 3 separate questions, we've assigned 150%.
Do you understand that? Serious crap!
Another huge flaw with this premise, that can be expanded upon in the future but is certainly worth mentioning here, is that since Pascal isn't merely stating that God is beyond our comprehension, but rather that we can know absolutely nothing about God, he is contradicting himself. In order to assert that God is incomprehensible, one must comprehend something about God, namely that God is incomprehensible. You see the problem? For Pascal to say that we can't know anything about God, he must know something about God. Again, this needs expanding, but consider it a cherry on top. While this premise is valid, it is definitely flawed. Throughout this video series, I've been insisting that Pascal's wager doesn't require his first monstrous premise. And now that we've covered it thoroughly, I'll let Pascal himself explain why. Towards the end of his initial presentation, he writes the following.
But there's here an infinity happy life to gain. A chance of gain against a finite number of chances of loss. And what you stake is finite. And it is all divided. Whenever the infinite is, and there's not an infinity of chances of loss against that of gain. There's no time to hesitate. You must give all.
In essence, Pascal reasons that even if the chances of God existing is 0.1%, one would still be a fool not to wager all in God's favour, since, by definition, an infinite gain eclipses any and all finite loss. Or as he puts it elsewhere, the finite is annihilated in the presence of the infinite and becomes a pure nothing. And he's absolutely correct. Granted, he spoke as if belief in God costs nothing whatsoever, and that not believing in God gains you nothing whatsoever, and both are colloquially false. But his point is that since these costs are finite, and that they stand in the presence of the infinite, they are, indeed, a pure nothing. If we contrast any finite number, no matter how large, against the infinite, it does become a nothing. And so, while Pascal's first premise is no doubt monstrously flawed, his argument not only works without it, but given the nature of infinity, his argument is substantially stronger than our intuition would have us believe. On matters of mathematics, Pascal was a genius, and I, for one, am very impressed. This man lived during the infancy of calculus, and yet he grasped the concept of infinity better than most people alive today. I don't know about you, but that very much commands my respect. So, to be clear, the monstrous premise is slain, but its death does not defeat the wager. The next objection, however, does, and it's a beautiful headshot. Talking of which, if you're watching this through the playlist, that objection will play automatically after this video. But if you're not in the playlist, you can find a link to it in the description or comment section. Anyhow, I'm Stephen Woodford, and as always, thank you kindly for the view, and an extra special thank you to my wonderful patrons and those of you who have supported the channel via other means.
All right. Heads then.
Well done. Don't put it in your pocket.
Sir?
Don't put it in your pocket. It's your lucky quarter.